Well, I think that if you look at the multilateral development banks, the African Development Bank is probably the one that needs the most support in terms of increasing resources in comparison to the problems it has to solve on the African continent. We have to remember that more than 50% of the world's poor on the continent now. And as we move forward, if we don't act with urgency and scale, there are 400 million poor people now. There'll be 500 million in the next decade or so if we don't act. This is the continent where access to infrastructure in terms of electricity, water, sanitation is the most difficult. Africa, by the end of this century, we have 600 million youth, twice as many as the rest of the world. They need to be employed and gainfully engaged in productive activities. So if you think about all this, it means that the continent really needs to work hard to create jobs, create employment, improve lives of poor people. African Development Bank and the ADF, they are the primary instruments to generate development on the continent, working with the governments. Therefore, we need to support the institution for a substantial capital increase. There will be billions, hundreds of billions of dollars needed to do this. And the capital increase will enable the African Development Bank to make some kind of a material difference in doing this. Well, my thoughts are, of course, the bank faces many challenges on the continent. I've mentioned the challenge of creating jobs, the challenge of educating the young people, improving the human development indicators on the continent. But the bank, to do this, needs also to sharpen its delivery methodology, be more efficient and effective, and in disbursing its resources and in helping governments implement on the ground. I believe that the president has been restructuring the bank to move in this direction, creating regional offices. I think there are more than 36 now on the continent, at least more than 30 that have been opened, where people are now more on the ground, working with governments to help them deliver. He's trying to strengthen the staff. The disbursements have increased beyond what they were. The costs of running the bank are in hand. And so I think on many indicators, the bank is moving forward to strengthen itself. Is it there 100%? The answer is no. It still has to keep working hard. But I believe it's on the right path to help the continent deliver, and we need to support it strongly. Africa's most urgent need is physical and human infrastructure. What do I mean by that? Electricity. We have to make sure that better than 50% of the population, the statistics we have now of access to electricity, to sanitation, to water, are very low. We have to move from 50% or slightly over of the population having access to good infrastructure to at least 80 to 90% if we have to improve and meet the Sustainable Development Goals. We have to improve access to health and education. And therefore, these are the key things that the bank needs to focus on to help deliver. These are the vital things that are needed on the continent. You cannot improve lives of poor people without access to basic services, meaning basic water and sanitation, access to rural roads, access to urban infrastructure, to electricity above all, so that SMEs can create jobs. And you cannot improve lives if children, especially girls, cannot go to school. So these are some of the key things I think are vital on the continent. Africa has a maternal mortality rate of 814 per 100,000. That's not acceptable. It's just not acceptable. We have to do better than that. We can't have women dying on a daily basis on this continent when we have the technology to stop it. So some of these things are what we have to focus on right now. I believe that we have to look for innovative ways to increase the resource availability to the African Development Bank and the African Development Fund. We already talked about the general capital increase, which is needed. We saw that the last ADF was not as substantial as it could have been. So we know that ODA is getting more difficult. So in between all this, we need to come up with new ways and ideas of doing things. And one of the things that the big bond is suggesting, the idea of the big bond is, can we get governments, working with the African Development Bank to provide guarantees that could allow the bank to front load resources, similar to what Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Innovation, of which I'm chair, we have a mechanism called the International Finance Facility for Immunization. We're able to get guarantees to front-load resources to save lives. And we're trying to think of a structure that could allow the African Development Bank to work with governments, to be the intermediary to do this. Now, why is that? Why should it be? Because we believe that for the African continent, the bank has the unique opportunity of being able to couple the resources this will generate with some very deep and constructive dialogue on the restructuring of some of the sectors, of some of these countries, of some of the economies, in a way that is probably more difficult for other international organizations outside the continent. It has a privileged position of trust and respect from these governments that will enable it to tackle very difficult subjects. So the idea is, if you can bundle the additional financial resources as moderately concessional loans to credit-worthy countries, coupled with advice on key sectors like education, like health, like water and sanitation, even in human development, where we can say to our governments, you need to change your way of doing business in this area or this sector. We will support you with additional resources and advice if you will do this. I think the African Development Bank has a unique position of trust to do this. That is why we are suggesting that it be the key intermediary for this big bond. Because we have to think outside the box to solve the problems of the sub-Saharan Africa, of the African continent as a whole. If we continue to do business as usual, in the incremental way we are doing it now, we're not going to be able to confront the problems of 500 million more people falling into poverty. The continent needs to grow at a faster pace in order for GDP per capita growth to be positive. So Africa needs to grow and develop. We need to make sure that we don't have 500 million people in poverty, instead that we don't have more people falling into poverty. What we need to do is get them out of poverty. We need to make sure that we don't have 600 million youths by the end of this century who are seeking to migrate out of the continent instead of staying on it. If Africa can have some spillover effects, as they call, that are negative on the rest of the globe and on Europe. So donors who are there, it is more in the interest for us to work together to turn all these phenomena into positives. I am very convinced as an African that we can have a strong and positive effect, but we can do it working together with partners. It would be better to work together rather than alone. And I'm very, very sure that if the donors look at all this, they'll see that it's in their interest to work with the African continent. Yes, the Africans bear the primary responsibility to solve their own problems. So I'm not saying that should fall on the shoulder of donors, but surely as partners, they can help. The comparative advantage of the African Development Bank is that it is the continent's bank. It has the trust of the governments on the continent. It is close to the ground. It knows what the problems are. It can easily deploy its people quickly to each part of the continent, and it can deliver in a way that is close to the people. That closeness means a lot. It means it has a stronger chance to implement programs and projects in a way that communities, not just governments, but communities and people understand, support, and own. So it has a strong comparative advantage also in delivering tough messages to governments because they know it's their bank and they trust it, that it can be objective. It can tell them when there's good news, but it can also equally tell them when the news is not so good.